Hey everyone, our substance designer time is kind of cut short. I wish we had more time to do it, but since we're doing substance painter, I figured the rest of the information I'll just kind of stick it into this video and you can watch it whenever. But really quick, I'm just going to cover two things. One is like the modularity and why we use different graphs, and then the other one is how to actually render your work. So I don't think it's super important for today's assignment, but for the assignment one, when you render your realistic material, it's best to submit this way. So this is the brick material I did for my assignment a few years ago. And you'll notice I'm doing the same kind of base material thing, outputs as well. The reason we add these outputs is so that you can go ahead and export your outputs as bitmaps. Without these, you can't do that. Normally you name them. You can see I didn't even name them here. But this customization also let me put it in Unreal Engine with an RMAO. So that's why I did it that way. But I'll go ahead and drag this on. So this is just about what everybody has. And I'll just show you a bit more. I'll share this file with you instead of the one that I made during the lecture because it's a little bit easier to follow. You can see my process from like black and white shapes, adding details slowly, staying in black and white, just black and white, just black and white. And then, color is its own thing, roughness is its own thing, AO is its own thing, blending materials is all its own thing. It's a little bit easier to follow this one than the one I made in class. I have like proper spacing and stuff. And then I'll talk a bit about why we have like different graphs, because it's probably a bit confusing, doesn't make a lot of sense. So if I open up this graph here, you'll see it's just it's pretty small, and it's just kind of making this rough looking shape. And instead of having all of these nodes inside of my main graph, it's a lot simpler and easier to understand if we separate them. And what you can actually do is just drag that graph in, and you can see my output from that graph, this here, is now in my brick graph. So it's sort of like a function in programming where I've just made this function on its own. It's very small and simple, and then over here in my main graph I'm calling that function. So you can see I've got one for shape 2, and cracks. So this one here is cracks, which is actually a compressed version of these nodes put together. And it can go deep as well, so you can see I made this using that other shape, which I just drag shape into cracks, and then drag cracks into brick wall. So that's why we use multiple graphs in one package. It's a pretty standard way to do it. There are other reasons to use multiple graphs, but it's not super pressing or not super important. Like you could have a whole different material. Wouldn't really recommend doing that. I'd recommend having a main one with some functions, but you could if you really wanted to. So now I'll just talk about actually rendering and submitting for your assignment. There's two parts to that. The first is this big graph here. It's going to be impossible for me to like go in and get a screenshot and get a screenshot and get a screenshot when I'm submitting the screenshot for the graph. But you can just press this little button up here, this camera button, and what that's going to do is export it at a 1:1 scale. This will mean it's a very big image size. If I go open it up now, you can see it's 2 megabytes and it's like 7,000 by 2,000 pixels. But what this allows you to do is anyone who's looking at this will actually be able to read and see your different parts of your graph. So instead of submitting like a screenshot, download this PNG and you can submit it this way. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is your actual material. So rather than having, just going screenshot and then screenshotting this or whatever and submitting that, it's much more effective to actually render it out. So we'll learn this in the substance class too, but there is a built-in renderer inside of this view that is more than just a default renderer. So I'll add my material back. I don't want to render it on this basic cube because this basic cube doesn't have room for height mapping really. So I'll go ahead and pick something more detailed. The most standard one that you'll see most often in like the industry posts is they'll use sphere 2 tiles. It gives a pretty good idea of what the shape's going to look like. And then I'll go to my editing settings like I've shown you before. This is where the scale is. So right now it's set to 1. And another quick tip about Substance Designer is, let's say I drag this all the way up. It's at 10. And it's at the end. So you'd think you can't go higher than that. But a lot of these are floating. So if I set it to 50, it will actually extend past 10. And now you can see it sets a new maximum of 100. You'd never want this really, but it's just something to keep in mind. If something's not giving you enough of an effect you want, or it's giving you too much of an effect you want, you can't go negative here. Oh, you can. There you go. So if something's not giving you enough or it's giving you too much, this slider isn't be all end all. You can up it. I'm just gonna set it to 10 though. Even that's a bit much. So 7. Set to 7. That looks pretty good. You can just play around with it until you get something you like. And then if I go to render, by default it's set to OpenGL. But OpenGL is not super powerful render, so what we can do is set it to iRay. And it's going to take a second, but now it's rendering the same way that Cycles would. So it's using, proper reflection, proper lighting, using raycasting. So this is a much better way to render out your materials. And I'll just full screen that now by pressing this button. When you export, it'll export to your screen size. So you can see now that I've full screened, it's exporting in 2K. It's still doing iterations. It might take a little bit of time, depending on the strength of your computer. There's a few more things we're going to do. It's not quite final here. The first is I'm going to find a specific view that I like. So if you use this camera part, I can say like view the left side. And this one looks pretty good, but let's pretend it doesn't. I can look at the right side. Maybe I don't like this one. I'll go back to left. And you don't have to worry about accidentally moving it really, because it always goes back to the same spot. And let's say I like this front view the most. Right now it's completely in shadow. I'm not a huge fan of that. So I'm going to hit this little light icon here. I'm going to hit Control and Shift. And then with right mouse I can start moving my light source around. So a pretty good way to go about it is to just get part of it in shadow, part of it not in shadow. I'll probably do it like this. I think that looks pretty good. And when I'm finally happy with my render, I'll let it iterate for a while. I'll come up to Camera, and I can hit Save Render. But there are other things you can change. If I go into Edit here, let me shrink this. You can see we can change things. So I've lowered the exposure already. By default, it's at 0. You can see it's quite bright. I wasn't a huge fan of that, so I just lowered it a bit. And you can change your rotation and stuff here as well if you don't want to change it through the viewport. You can also do things like add ground. Wouldn't recommend this one personally though, doesn't make a lot of sense. Or you can visualize the environment where it's getting the lighting from. In your actual render though, I'd leave this out. So now I've got this. I like how it looks. I'll full screen it to make sure it's the proper resolution. And I'll go ahead and hit Save Render. And I can save it as whatever. Brick sphere. And then I'll just do this again for a different view. So this time I'll go plain high res. This is another pretty standard view. And I'll just hit perspective this time. can zoom in a bit, and you can see this gives a pretty good idea of what it's going to look like on a flat surface, and I will save this as well. So save render, bricks plane, and now I can submit my graph fully visible. I can submit my bricks plane, my brick sphere, and you'd have your model render as well. But this is how you can make your renders look just so much more professional, and it'll look much better in the submission. Thanks, guys.